Okay, well, good afternoon, all, and thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon. My name is Marika van der Steenhoven, and I am the Special Collections Education and Outreach Librarian for the Bowdoin College Library. I am delighted to welcome you to our penultimate event in our series, Beyond the Reading Room, Archives in the World. This has been a virtual lecture series featuring artists, scholars, and Bowdoin College alumni who rely on archival research for their work. Each speaker has a connection to Bowdoin Library's George J. Mitchell Department of Special Collections and Archives, either having consulted our collections or having their own work represented therein. You can check out the previous talks via the link that I'll post in the chat in just a moment, and I encourage you to sign up for our remaining 2 programs this semester. The final Beyond the Reading Room Archives in the World talk will take place Thursday, December 3rd at 9:30 a.m. With Don Westfall, who is Bowdoin class of 1972. Don will be discussing his research on the college's historic land acquisition across the state of Maine. And the following day, Friday, December 4th at 12:30 p.m., we will host our final Audubon page-turning event of this semester. For those uninitiated into our page-turning tradition, Bowdoin is the caretaker of a magnificent double elephant folio edition of John James Audubon's Birds of America that depict each of these birds at life size. And we celebrate this work and the intersections across a multitude of disciplines and issues each month at our page-turning event. On December 4th, we are delighted to welcome scholar and naturalist Jacqueline L. Scott, who will discuss birding while black and the complex entanglement of Audubon and slavery. Again, you can register for these programs via the link that I'll post in the chat in just a moment. I want to thank the Bowdoin College Library for supporting this program series, to Tony Sprague for his incomparable technical support, and for alumni and to Alumni Relations for helping us spread the word about this series. Today, we are joined by Susan F. Beegel, who will be sharing her talk, Harriet Beecher Stowe, The Pearl of Orr's Island and Maine Summer Tourism, an illustrated lecture that explores how the popularity of Stowe's best-selling novel, The Pearl of Orr's Island, coincided with the coming of tourism to Maine's Casco Bay, and how pearl-based tourism helped a small Maine fishing village reinvent itself for a new summer economy. Some of you may recall that Susan had given an iteration of this lecture to a jam-packed audience at the Stowe House at Bowdoin several years ago. And for many of us in the audience, it opened our eyes to Harriet Beecher Stowe beyond the seminal work of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and helped us to thoughtfully situate Stowe in our own community and to Maine more broadly. Susan F. Beegle holds a PhD in English from Yale University. She served for many years as the editor of the Hemingway Review and taught in the Maritime Studies program of Williams College at Mystic Seaport. A Maine native, Susan is the author or editor of 4 books and more than 50 articles on various aspects of American literature and history. Her most recent work on Harriet Beecher Stowe, researched with the help of Bowdoin's Special Collections, has appeared in American Literary Realism and New England Quarterly. Susan is a great friend and supporter of the Bowdoin College Library. Her help growing our collections of visual Stowiana materials has been invaluable in understanding Stowe's life and the impact of her writing. Susan's contributions to the collections feature prominently in our instruction program, a program that emphasizes and integrates primary sources into Bowdoin's curriculum and supports student and faculty research and scholarship. It is an honor and a great pleasure to welcome Susan here today. Hi, Susan.
Hi, thank you, Marika. And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you all so much for logging on. I'm really honored to be here. It's been really magical to have a chance to work in Bowdoin's Special Collections and to visit the historic house where Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. I thank the college for taking such good care of all these wonderful resources for the community. And I'm really looking forward to the pandemic being over soon so that we can come out to play together. So today my interest is in a different book by Harriet Beecher Stowe, not Uncle Tom, but her only Maine novel, The Pearl of Orr's Island. When I retired home to Maine, I thought it would be fun to explore possible biographical connections between Stowe and Orr's Island, and to look for any real life sources for characters and events in her novel. And to my surprise, I found almost none that I could document. When I'd ask Islanders about these things, they would go strangely silent and maybe give each other a little side eye. But then on eBay, I found hundreds of vintage postcards, many of them more than a century old, that suggested that there was once a flourishing Orr's Island tourist industry that was centered on pearl. So my scholarly question then became, what the heck was going on out there? So let's have a little background. I know a lot of people won't have read this book. That's okay. We'll tell you a little bit about it and about Stowe's time in Maine. Pearl was first published in book form in 1862, and it offers a detailed portrait of daily life in early 19th century Maine in a community that centered on family shipbuilding, fishing, and seafaring. Focusing on the customs, the dialect, and the traditions of coastal Maine, the novel is an early example of American literary regionalism. It's also a pioneering work of domestic realism, rich really in the details of women's daily lives. You can learn how to make clam chowder or refurbish a bonnet or soothe a colicky baby by reading Pearl. Stowe's novel inspired younger writers, including Mark Twain, Louisa May Alcott, and most especially Sarah Orne Jewett, who credited this novel with making her want to become a writer, and whose Country of the Pointed Firs is actually an homage to Stowe's Pearl. So Mara Lincoln is the heroine of the story, if you haven't read it in a while or ever. She's a frail and religious girl who's orphaned when her sea captain's ship goes down and her mother dies in premature childbirth from shock. Mara lives with her grandparents, Zephaniah and Mary Pennell, and Mara is the Pearl of Orr's Island. Mara has an adopted brother, Moses, an orphan who washes ashore clutched in the arms of his drowned mother after a different shipwreck. There's no melodrama here. And Mara has a best friend, the robust and outdoorsy Sally Kittridge. Pearl is actually a coming of age story about these three children as they grow to adulthood on Orr's Island. And there are other memorable characters too that we're going to talk a little bit about, especially Sally's father, the yarn spinning fisherman, Captain Kittridge, and a wise elderly spinster named Aunt Roxy. The book features a love triangle. You could probably see that coming. Shipwrecks, smugglers, ghosts, and lots of sentimental melodrama. So in its time, you may not have heard of it today, but in its time, Pearl was a big bestseller. It went through 40 editions, that's 40 editions between 1862 and 1925. And these are years that also mark the growth of America's tourist industry. After the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, an ever-expanding network of rail lines began to cover the country and to connect with steamship lines at the coasts. So at the same time, the nation's cities are also growing exponentially, and Americans are becoming increasingly eager to escape urban crowding and heat in the summer. So Portland, Maine becomes a transportation hub as tourists eager to explore the coast begin arriving by steamship from New York and Boston and by train from Chicago and other points west. Thousands of city dwellers understandably wanted to visit the beautiful world of Stowe's Maine novel. And to meet this demand, the Pearl of Orr's Island would transform their fishing village into something that's a lot like a theme park. The Pearl of Orr's Island would spawn a literal cottage industry that lasted for several decades during the height of the book's popularity. There's just one problem. There wasn't a lot on Orr's Island firmly associated with either Stowe or her novel to interpret. So islanders began to exercise considerable creativity in giving tourists the Pearl of Orr's Island experience they craved. In the words of one visitor, when the kind and courteous people now living on the island find that all visitors wish to indulge in the feeling that local facts were actually incorporated in the fiction, they very graciously try to assent. So it's this phenomenon, the Pearl of Orr's Island, and its role in transforming the island's culture and economy from fishing to summer tourism, that we're really going to talk about today. So Harriet Beecher Stowe came to Maine and lived in Brunswick from 1850 to 1852, just 2 short years, while her husband Calvin taught religion at Bowdoin. Later, she would call these years the happiest of her life. They were certainly busy. During this time, she cared for her 6 children, who ranged in age from a baby born in Maine, she was 7 months pregnant when she arrived here, to twin teenage girls. She presided over a 19th century household without electricity or indoor plumbing, and she helped to run a small school with her sister Catherine. And as if this wasn't enough, famously, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, her first novel, driving it through 41 weekly installments in the national era from June 1851 to April 1852. So clearly Harriet Beecher Stowe is very good at time management. However, she did not have a lot of free time to enjoy what she called the wildly, peculiarly beautiful scenery of this belt of coast. But we know that she visited Orr's Island at least twice, as well as lots of local stretches of coast, Mere Point, McCoy, Middle Bay, Harpswell, and Birch Island. Together with her children, she enjoyed beachcombing, fishing, boating, and cooking clam chowder on the beach. And it's important to realize that her visits did not attract any attention, and that's part of the problem. She wasn't yet the famous author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was just another professor's wife from Bowdoin taking her children on an outing. So no one really remembered meeting her. And if she was interested in you as a model for a character in a book, she tried really hard for you not to find that out. So she was kind of a mystery woman. Now, there's no tourism to speak of at this time in the 1850s. Stowe tells us that Orr's Island was visited only occasionally by a stray party from Brunswick come down to visit the romantic scenery of the solitary island. It was really time consuming to get there. At least one of Stowe's visits to Orr's was by horse and carriage, which was a round trip from the Brunswick house of 6 to 8 hours. Because there were no hotels or restaurants on the island then, visitors had to take meals or spend the night at private homes. Only one piece of evidence suggests that Stowe based any character in the novel on an actual islander, but she unhelpfully doesn't say who it was. In an 1852 letter, Harriet wrote to her husband, "I greatly need living studies for the filling in of my sketches. There is a sturdy, independent fisherman farmer. In his old age, he attends prayer meetings and reads the Missionary Herald. I must go to Orr's Island and see him again." The character Stowe describes here will become Zephaniah Pennell, Mara's grandfather, and his original may have been Ralph Johnson, who was an older fisherman farmer and a deacon of the Harpswell Center Church. Orr's had no church of its own in Stowe's time, so islanders actually rowed across the bay to Harpswell for services. And Harriet visited that church often with her best friends from the Bowdoin community, the Reverend Thomas Upham and his wife Phoebe. Thomas was a governor of the Harpswell Church, so it's very likely that the Uphams introduced Stowe to Deacon Johnson. And Johnson family tradition says Stowe had tea in this Orr's Island home, but can we trust it is the question. Now, Stowe felt that Maine had potential for a tourist industry. In 1852, she wrote, It seems to us quite wonderful that in all the ecstasies that have been lavished on American scenery, this beautiful state of Maine should have been so much neglected. The islands along the Maine coast are a study for the tourist. And they also inspired Harriet as an artist. This watercolor is her stylized rendition of a Casco Bay scene. I think it might be Beals Cove from Johnson Point on Orr's Island, but it's too stylized to really tell. Now, in the late spring of 1852, Harriet was saddened when Calvin decided to leave Bowdoin and accept a better paid position at Andover Theological Seminary in Massachusetts. So soon she was off to Andover by herself to prepare a new house for her family. Newly published in book form, Uncle Tom's Cabin was just beginning to bring her money and success. She was actually hoping it might earn enough so that she could buy a silk dress. As she worked on outfitting the Andover house and enjoyed spending time on her own, as only a mother of 6 can do, she naturally began thinking about her next novel. And what I want to do here is read you just a little bit of a letter that she wrote to Calvin at this time. My dear husband, well, the inspiration has come at last. I have had a vision, and the next thing I do will be to embody my deep love to the beautiful state of Maine in a story. It is to be called The Pearl of the Islands. How I have loved these beautiful shores, these glittering seas, these rocks yellow with seaweed, and the brave old sailors, and the bright-eyed beautiful children, and the crystal-hearted true good people that live along its shores. And before I go from it, I must sail once through the islands. I must go to Orr's Island and talk to that good old man and his wife who are to sit unconsciously as portraits. This story will be the pearl of my stories, a purely creative thing of which the material shall be American. I will invest with poetry and romance this dreamy old sea. Calvin kept her letter, and eventually he pasted it inside his own copy of The Pearl of Orr's Island. Now, Harriet's idyll did not last long. Uncle Tom's Cabin was poised to become the best-selling book of its time, and a perfect storm of controversy was about to break over her head. She became internationally famous, even infamous, and her time would never be her own again. In short order, she would have to defend Uncle Tom's Cabin from Southern critics who said that the picture of slavery it presented was fake. Within a year, she produced A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, a compendium of facts for the people. You can see her title there. So a whole book of facts about slavery. And as soon as it was done, she sets off on what was to be the first of several triumphant tours of Europe. She kept getting invitations back. So The Pearl of Orr's Island was forgotten in this rush of other projects. And then in 1857, tragedy struck when the Stowe's eldest son, Henry, who was a freshman at Dartmouth College by that time, was drowned while swimming in the Connecticut River. Seeking comfort, Harriet and Calvin returned to Brunswick with their 7-year-old Charlie to stay for a few days with their close friends, the Uphams. I haven't seen evidence that she visited Orr's in 1857, but her letters tell us that she spent considerable time at the shore. And memories of the happy years in Maine when Henry and her other children were young came flooding back to her. But it wasn't until December 1860 that Harriet finally began writing The Pearl of Orr's Island as a weekly serial for a religious newspaper called The Independent. She was also writing another novel, Agnes of Sorrento, for serialization at the same time, which is a real Harriet thing, writing 2 books at the same time for serialization. But the start of the Civil War in April 1861 and the departure of her second son, Freddie, for the front did interrupt her work for 6 months. She apologized to her readers. Who could write on stories that had a son to send to battle with Washington beleaguered and the whole country shaken as with an earthquake? Stowe finally finished in 1862. 10 years in the making. Pearl went through 5 printings in its first month as a book. Okay, so giving America a few years to recover from the war and consolidate its transportation system, let's fast forward to 1880, when Harper's Magazine hires a journalist named William Henry Bishop to write a travel log titled Fish and Men in the Maine Islands. Of all the islands in Casco Bay, Bishop chose Orr's Island for a visit because, as he put it, Harriet Beecher Stowe had set foot on it to make it famous. He finds an island that is unprepared for summer tourism. To reach his destination, he takes a little steamer from Portland, but it doesn't stop at Orr's Island. Instead, he must get off at Harpswell and hire someone to row him over to the island in a dory. There is no hotel, and he must board at a local home. The price is $4 a week, which Bishop finds extravagant because the meals are, and this is his word, I love this word, unhygienic. For breakfast, he is served half a mess of clams, heavy dough biscuits, tea without milk, 3 kinds of cake, stewed peaches, and stewed prunes. And that's your unhygienic breakfast. The island's industry is not tourism, but fishing, and the entire community is involved. Like Captain Pennell and young Moses in the novel, islanders fish for cod, haddock, pollock, and hake in nearshore waters. Bishop observes that the houses on the island are surrounded by lattice-work tables for drying salted fish. The Maine islander, he writes, has them about his house as a farmer elsewhere might have rows of beehives or milk pans or a vineyard. In the summer, again like Captain Pennell and Moses in their schooner Brilliant, islanders follow migrating fish to the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. So the world of Orr's Island in 1880 then is quite similar to the world Stowe encountered in the 1850s. Bishop's first thoughts when he steps ashore are of characters and scenes from her novel. He sees 2 little children gathering berries along the road and thinks of Mara and Moses. He sees the distant white spire of the Harpswell Church, and he remembers the characters in the novel sailing there on Sundays. He has lunch at the home of a lively young woman, and he thinks of Sally Kittridge. He is not alone. Pearl of Orr's Island tourism has begun without any effort on the island's part. A bluff old gentleman said to be the Captain Pennell of the narrative tells Bishop that fans of the novel are now coming away from as far as the West and even from Canada to, and this is how he puts it, give themselves unnecessary trouble hunting for people in places that never existed. Visitors want to identify picturesque island residents with characters in the novel and locate fictitious places, such as the grotto where Moses and Sally enjoy a romantic rendezvous, or the cove where smugglers meet in the dead of night. But islanders are not yet ready to exploit this unexpected bonanza of interest. Instead, Bishop tells us that they resent Mrs. Stowe's willful misrepresentation of them and believe that the novel should confine itself strictly to a line of events that had actually happened. There never was no such folks and no such talking folks, one man says. There ain't no caves and no smugglers. My brother-in-law's farm's been alongside Long's Cove for 50 years and he never saw them. There are no pearl-themed businesses or merchandise either, not even souvenir postcards. In the 1880s, all Americans used blank prepaid postcards for business only, like this one from Orr's Island inquiring about the price of hake sounds. Instead of buying souvenirs, tourists cut bark off the old captain's apple trees for mementos, destroying his orchard. But the world of fish and men was about to change. In 1881, the newly organized Harpswell Steamboat Company began offering 4 round trips a day from Portland to islands in the eastern half of Casco Bay. The scenic route was 20 miles long, arriving at Orr's Island in about 2 hours. the island began to experience a real estate and construction boom in the rush to accommodate the influx of tourists and would-be summer residents. In June 1888, the Orr's Island newspaper reported that Mrs. Ada Prince has finished her house and has it well fitted up for company. Mr. William Reed is building a new cottage for Mr. Thompson of Lisbon, and S.C. Prince is advertising a desirable cottage lot for sale. In 1891, a reporter from New York stayed at a boarding house called Kittridge Cottage. Captain Kittridge was the novel's most popular character, and every tourist wanted to meet a Maine fisherman just like him. Islanders had stopped maintaining that there never was no such folks. Instead, they have agreed, the reporter wrote, that this is the one-story gambrel-roofed cottage where Captain Kittridge lived, even though no family by the name of Kittridge had ever been known on the island. A stay at Kittridge Cottage seems to have been the reporter's sole encounter with pearl tourism. Fishing and sailing are the chief amusements that offer, he wrote, and the scenery is beautiful. But all of Casco Bay's islands had fishing, sailing, and beautiful scenery to recommend them. Orr's Island was the last stop on the Harpswell Steamboat line, which also served Long, Little, Hope, and Cliff Islands, the Harpswell Peninsula, and Bailey Island. So the island needed to do something to distinguish itself from its competition, and both local businesses and the Harpswell Steamboat Company began marketing Orr's Island as the scene of Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe's fascinating story. This strategy bore fruit on July 1st, 1896, when Stowe quietly passed away at the age of 85. The death of the celebrated author of Uncle Tom's Cabin was front page news around the world, spiking a resurgence of interest in her life and writing. And the small island in Maine immediately felt the shock. Orr's Island has been a favorite resort this summer, announced the Kansas City Star. The recent death of Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe has revived interest in the Pearl of Orr's Island. Tourists from Boston and nearby places, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and many of the Western states were arriving in unprecedented numbers, and people in Kansas were interested in that. In 1896, these tourists traveled to the island on the Harpswell Company's elegant new steamers, Sebascodegan and Mackinac. This 1896 travel guide promotes Orr's Island as a pearl-themed destination. The book quotes extensively from purple passages in the novel suited to attracting tourists. On Orr's Island, the sea seems to flash and glitter like some strange gem, and neat white houses nestle like sheltered doves in the beautiful solitude. The book then recommends, while on Orr's Island, visit the grotto. If islanders had once firmly informed Bishop that there ain't no caves, now they were marketing Stowe's fictitious grotto as a place you could actually visit for a fee. The book also recommends visits to the Pennell House and the Pearl House, two rival opportunities to tour the fictitious home where Stowe's heroine Mara lived with her Pennell grandparents. The Pearl House, once Deacon Johnson's home, would soon annihilate its competition, becoming the longest standing Stowe attraction on Orr's Island, even though it was a white cape and not like the Pennell home in the novel, a brown lean-to house. There were still no hotels on the island, but this photo of an Orr's Island clam bake suggests the food had improved since Bishop's visit. Islanders were starting to discover that tourists, for some strange reason, really enjoyed fresh lobster. Maine native and Boston journalist Elizabeth Orr Williams was among the many tourists who visited Orr's Island in 1896. Taking a copy of Stowe's novel with her, she sailed for the spot, determined to read the story anew upon its shores. And Williams's article for the Boston Evening Transcript offers a comprehensive picture of pearl-based tourism in its heyday. So we'll spend a little time with her. First, she rented a horse and carriage and drove to the Devil's Back, a high rock formation with steep sides that's described in Stowe's novel. Williams holds her breath as the wheel tires roll fearfully near that precipice. Safely on the other side, she finds the cove where the smuggler Captain Atkinson tries to recruit Moses for a voyage to the West Indies. No one tells her that there ain't no smugglers. Next, Williams visits the supposed home of Aunt Roxy, as she calls it, Stowe's spicy and decided spinster. In the novel, Aunt Roxy lives in a one-story gambrel-roofed cottage. I don't know why, but Stowe really liked a gambrel roof. The tourist attraction was a two-story federal farmhouse. Williams records her pleasure in the old house with its heavy beams exposed to view and its capacious chimney with its ancient crane and andirons. Like the Pearl of Oars Island, Aunt Roxy House evoked nostalgia for days gone by. There were still no for-the-purpose souvenirs, but Williams collects china, a new hobby, and cajoles the owners into giving her an old Staffordshire blue plate, a transaction that suggests the origins of the Maine antiques industry. Next, Williams visits the alleged home of the Kittridges, a gambrel-roofed house near a curved beach where Pearl and Sally Kittridge played together. Williams finds only photographs to support the fiction that the house once belonged to Stowe's old sea captain. In the parlor hang photographs of Captain Kittridge as supposed, she writes, there is a twinkle in his eye that makes one think he enjoys telling sea yarns, selling them too. After visiting the supposed home of Aunt Roxy and the alleged home of the Kittridges, Williams continues on to the so-called home of Pearl, the island's best-known boarding house. And there she finds two very genial, lovable, obliging women and scores a very old sugar bowl. So she's taking their china as she goes. She then spends the night at a private home thrown open to summer visitors, as there were still no hotels on Oars. And the next morning, she heads for the ocean side of the island, where old Neptune sends breakers up on the rocks and visits one of the grottos. Now, her final visit to Oars Island is a little strange, but it's to the Oars Island Cemetery, which had also become a tourist attraction. There she hears the story of an unhappy woman who drowned herself in Long Cove and is shown the epitaph on the woman's tombstone, a poem written by her grieving husband. Williams quotes two lines of his long effusion, as she calls it, with nerves and sails unfurled, she steered her bark to yonder world. And Williams adds sarcastically, all this cut and lettered in marble and free to the reading public. The unhappy woman was Elizabeth Dunning Wire, whose suicide by drowning in April 1851 has nothing whatsoever to do with the Pearl of Oars Island. But one of the novel's most dramatic incidents involves that discovery of a drowned woman's body washed ashore after a shipwreck with the baby Moses clutched in her dead arms. So confronted by Pearl tourists who believe that, quote, a girl was actually washed ashore, Oars Island tour guides took them to Elizabeth Wire's unusual tombstone with its pathetic poetry. That was the best they could offer. On Oars Island in 1896, then, Williams found something like a Pearl of Oars Island theme park flooded with tourists. She marvels at the steamboats coming and going, carrying people from as far away as the West and Canada. Tourists could visit the Pearl House, Captain Kittridge House, Aunt Roxy House, and the grotto, but still it wasn't enough. Williams mentions two young men busily snapping the Kodak and knocking on the doors of private houses to ask, can you tell us where the Harriet Beecher Stowe house is? No one told them that there wasn't one. The business of summering on Oars Island continued to grow. In 1897, the Harpswell Steamboat Company added a third vessel, the Casco. In 1898, the Harpswell line carried, if you've been to Oars Island, just think about this for a minute, 100,000 passengers. And the island's first hotels, Merritt House and Mascot House, opened their doors. Cottages sprang up overnight as islanders subdivided their land for sale. In 1902, a Minneapolis newspaper observed that after Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe published The Pearl of Oars Island, the rush to buy eligible lots of land resembled the rush of Sooners to a newly opened Indian reservation. Orr's Island, they wrote, became the objective of excursionists, clam chowder parties, and an army of summer idlers. In 1899, Islander William Doughty wrote his own guidebook for tourists, an historical sketch of Orr's Island. Doughty, a shopkeeper, had been to sea as a boy and served throughout the Civil War in the 11th Maine Volunteers. He's one of the more reliable storytellers on the island. He describes the island's history, its families, its neighborhoods, and their distinctive attractions. And this is interesting. He emphasizes that the island's principal business is fishing. And he cautions visitors against viewing fishermen as quaint or insular. Most of the men, he warns us, are able to take charge of a vessel and navigate her from the banks of Newfoundland to the coast of Florida, and most of them have visited every seaport city on the coast of the United States. But Doughty also hints at the competition and bitterness that the pearl industry was causing in this small community of 440 year-round residents. There is, he says, some conflicting among local celebrities as to where the Pearls House and the grotto were located, he notes. Such conflicts would continue. These early 20th century postcards show two different sites being promoted as the grotto at the same time. We do not wish to antagonize anyone's opinion, writes Doughty, but we must conclude after reading Mrs. Stowe's book that in fixing locations, individuals have been very partial to their own interests. Was the Pearl of Orr's Island a whole cloth romance, or was it based on facts, he asks. We say that we do not know. At about the same time, a summer resident of Orr's Island named Annie Haven Thwing began keeping an extra illustrated edition of Pearl, filling her personal copy of the book with photos of island places and people that she saw as illustrating the novel. A wealthy heiress from Boston who became a co-founder of the Orr's Island Public Library, Thwing was a well-known and respected amateur historian and author of a best-selling book about Boston's historic houses. Privately, Thwing decided that the Pearl House in Stowe's novel might have been an old lean-to style house that had since been torn down, that the house being marketed as Pearl House would be a better Captain Kittridge house, and that the house being marketed as the Kittridge home would be better as Aunt Roxy's cottage. Her conclusion, let each one read the Pearl of Orr's Island for himself and then try to verify the facts by actually going over the ground. By 1904, the Harpswell Steamboat Company had added yet another boat and was running 5 trips a day to the island. A new business arose, the sale of souvenirs. The Orr's Island General Store, owned by the Prince family, was among the first to engage in this trade. I think it's the Salt Cod Cafe today, if you ever stopped by there for blueberry muffins and coffee. It was located near the steamer dock, and it was capitalized by the steamboat line. Now, almost as soon as Congress authorized the sale of privately printed postcards in 1898, souvenir postcards of Pearl House began circulating. This very early Orr's Island postcard, in fact, it may be the first, has an image by island photographer Charles Davis. Of course, the image is black and white. There is no color photography available. And the image is small because postal regulations demand that the back of the card can only be used for the address. They haven't quite figured out how postcards work yet. Anyway, as you can see, this is a problem for somebody who wants to write a message on the postcard. In 1907, the so-called golden age of postcards began. The backs of cards were then divided to allow room for the message and an address, so the entire front could be devoted to an image. And at this time, publishers began importing beautifully colored lithographed cards from Germany. In an era before color photography, the German cards were highly desirable and collectible. Postcards of Kittridge House, Aunt Roxy House, and 2 different grottos joined several attractive views of the Pearl House and other island sites marking a thriving pearl industry. A nationwide craze for blue and white Staffordshire souvenir plates had begun at the end of the 19th century, and that was a craze islanders might have been trying to satisfy in 1896 when they let Elizabeth Williams take their actual antique plate as a memento. But by 1903, Orr's Island was printing its own Staffordshire plates, manufactured by Wedgwood, with a distinctive cabbage rose border and a central image of Pearl House on its rocky shore. To go with them, a tourist could purchase Mocklin-ware napkin rings imported from Scotland or a cream pitcher imported from Germany. Souvenir images of the Pearl House were so common that an anonymous reporter for the Lewiston Evening Journal, who visited Orr's Island in August 1905, wrote, "The Pearl House is a dear little old-fashioned house on the very edge of the shore, just as one sees in the pictures and upon the souvenir plates." So now we've reached that point in the history of tourism where people know what the house looks like, even if they've never been to Orr's Island. The Lewiston reporter in 1905 took a train to Brunswick and rented a horse and carriage to drive to the island. Like Stowe, she relished the scenery, but found the pretty stiff hills and the Devil's Back a bit harrowing. During her visit, the reporter met a woman she called dear old Aunt Roxy. 90-year-old Martha Sinnott was an island role player, so identified with the character that the name Aunt Roxy actually appears on her tombstone. And I wonder if that's simply the identification of Martha with Aunt Roxy or an attempt to improve the cemetery as a tourist attraction. The widow of fisherman George Sinnott, Martha had once made his home the favorite resort for many city boarders. As Aunt Roxy, she added some stretchers to the not precisely bona fide history of Orr's Island. Of Harriet Beecher Stowe, she has the pleasantest remembrances, the reporter writes, and loves to tell of the days when Stowe used to visit here for weeks and weeks at a time. That never happened. Martha Sinnott also helped to confuse the 1851 suicide of Elizabeth Wire with the fictitious death by shipwreck of Moses's mother. I actually think that this statue here, which Stowe saw at the Boston Athenaeum when she was working on Pearl, is the real impetus for the mother and the baby washing ashore. Okay, so in the novel, Aunt Roxy prepares the drowned corpse for burial. And when a tourist asks the role player about this experience, Aunt Roxy said that it was really true that the woman did go out early one morning and jump into the water and was found in the little cove above the Kittridge house, and that she was sent for to lay the body out. But Roxy goes on, there weren't any seashells in her hair, not even one. Of course, there might have been, but there weren't. That's just in the story. So what we have here is a little warning that all experiences are for sale, including laying out bodies. But beyond that, we have an islander who's impersonating a fictional character and corroborating the misreading of a tourist by substituting an historic occurrence for a fictional one, and then criticizing the novel for including invented details while acknowledging that they are realistic. So you can see the problem that any careful historian has in trying to untangle what is going on the island at this point. Now, this reporter also met the oldest man on Orr's Island, Captain Charles Black. 89 years old, Black was the archetypal crusty fisherman, sort of like Captain Kittridge. He had once captained his own schooners on the banks, but now he entertained tourists for a living. According to the reporter, he occasionally takes parties out in his little sailing craft, and needless to say, the features of these trips are his tales of the sea. Black is not a role player, but a member of a vanishing breed, and he is a commodity. With every hotel, boarding house, summer residence, and rental cottage full to overflowing, the reporter, and remember this is 1905, realizes that the island is no longer a fishing community. It is a significant fact that now only 4 schooners are owned by residents of Orr's Island, she writes, and that even these 4 are manned by sailors from other places. Summer inhabitants have taken the place of the fishing industry. They are more easily caught, and the fishermen no longer find it necessary to go to sea to fish. Fishermen are now the quaint subjects of postcards, and schooners have become party boats. Okay, so manners, morals, and literary tastes are changing. In 1908, an author named William Jasper Nichols attempted to write The Pearl of Orr's Island for the Times. The result, Brunhilde of Orr's Island, was a frothy romance expressly written for the vacation trade. Today, we would call it a beach read. Then this kind of book was called a hammock companion. So Brunhilde is nicknamed Hilda, and like Mara, heroine of The Pearl, Hilda is an orphan and lives in an old-fashioned island cottage with her uncle, the kindly fisherman Captain Gunther. But Hilda is no Victorian angel in the house. The story begins when Hilda, on a dare, rows out from Little Diamond Island and hitches a ride home to Orr's Island on a millionaire's steam yacht, not something Mara would ever do. The yacht's owner, a rich dilettante named Nelson Thomas, is the novel's romantic hero. Like Moses in Stowe's novel, Thomas is an unregenerate young man with an attraction to alcohol. Unlike Moses, the martini-drinking, cigarette-smoking Thomas will remain happily unreformed. After much romantic to and fro, he proposes to Hilda in a nature room indebted to Stowe's grotto, and she agrees to marry him if he can defeat her island boyfriend in a sailboat race. Nichols attempted to lighten Stowe's novel for a new generation by eliminating her heavy moralizing. If Nelson Thomas enjoys a martini, Captain Gunther enjoys his bootleg whiskey. There are no pious children in Brunhilde. No one's soul requires salvation, but there is lots of kissing. Kissing followed by ellipses, scarlet cheeks, and tumbled hair. This is not the world of Pearl, where, in Stowe's words, gentlemen are not at liberty to express their admiration to pretty young women, something we're trying to still impress upon them without much success. Most reviewers agreed that Brunhilde of Orr's Island was a fair to average hammock novel. But a snarky critic for the Baltimore Sun, who I suspect might be a young H.L. Mencken, even though this review is unsigned, concluded, "It has been a melancholy task to read this book, and it is still more melancholy one to write about it." A different book published in 1908 would give Pearl more serious competition. Another coming-of-age story about an orphaned girl living with an elderly couple in an old-fashioned house on an island. Lucy Maud Montgomery's best-selling Anne of Green Gables offered a more modern heroine. And interestingly, today, it's both the economic mainstay of tourism on Prince Edward Island and the focal point of a Canadian national park. There's a little more history there to merit this, but you can see how these beautiful novels of place tend towards tourism. Also, in 1908, the Harpswell Steamboat Company merged with two competitors, the Casco Bay Line and the Gurnett Line. And all three of the steamboat lines were now suddenly struggling to survive, having overexpanded into the now hotly contested summer trade. Together, they faced a challenge that would change the American vacation forever, the coming of the automobile. In the years 1911 to 1913, with funds from the brand new Maine Highway Commission, the Harpswell Islands undertook major improvements on their road to the mainland, including blasting through a massive granite ledge on Great Island. That's the island right before Orr's. Orr's Island postcards began to feature automobiles driving through the cut. Postcards, as you can also see, lost their charm. In 1914, when World War I broke out in Europe, Germany's printing factories were destroyed and their methods for color lithography were lost. Postcards, especially of the Pearl House, are going to continue for decades, but they are now inferior black and white images or much less appealing efforts to colorize them. So the modern world is growing antithetical both to Stowe's novel and its now quaint seeming vision of Orr's Island. In 1916, an author named Williams Haynes published a comical short story unmasking the island's pearl industry. Titled Tainted Money, it appears in a folksy volume of Maine tales called Casco Bay Yarns. Haynes, who summered on Cliff Island, was a technical writer from Connecticut, whose actual specialty was writing about industrial chemistry. Nevertheless, he had no qualms about spinning yarns or pretending to be a lobsterman. Tainted Money is a Romeo and Juliet story involving a feud between two Orr's Island families who have, in Haynes's word, divided the whole island into two warring camps. The cause of the quarrel, we're told, is a purely academic question touching the literary methods of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Before summer visitors began coming, Haynes writes, it was a matter of family pride on Orr's Island not to have been used as a model for a character in Pearl. After the summer people came, it was a matter of financial benefit to claim connection with characters or scenes in the book. So the head of one family profits from showing tourists the cove where the Pearl washed ashore after the shipwreck, really scrambled that story now, and charging admissions to see the smuggler's cave. His family intends to erect a tombstone in his memory bearing this legend: here lies Norman Skillings, who served Harriet Beecher Stowe as the original of Captain Kittridge, even though Norman was only 15 years old when the novel was written. The head of a rival clan maintains, and I'm quoting Haynes here, that a woman who could write Uncle Tom's Cabin wouldn't need to take no people she knew and put them in the Pearl of Orr's Island. She'd have brains enough to make the whole thing up out of her head, wouldn't she? He continues, there never was no such real people as the Pearl or Captain Kittridge, and them as claims they as characters in the book, or kin to characters in it, is fools or worse. So a concerned local minister urges Skillings' son to give up taking money under false pretenses and charging summer folks to see the cove if he wants to marry the daughter of the rival clan. He should make do with his fishing, his lobster pots, his 6 acres of good land, and his new motorboat to take summer people out sailing. But then we learn that the cove brings in $400 a season. Admission is 10 cents. This may not sound like much, but Haynes's figures, if they are accurate, imply that a Pearl concession might garner 4,000 visitors a summer. And $400 in 1916 was the equivalent of about $46,700 today. And that's really kind of a nice living. The story has a surprise conclusion, and I won't spoil it for you, but I will just say that by the end, the tainted money has corrupted everyone, including the minister. So America's entry into World War I was a major blow for Casco Bay hotels and steamers. Vacation travel was curtailed by naval operations and fear of German U-boats. The winter of 1917-18 was exceptionally cold. Boats struggled in the ice and landings were damaged. Just after the war ended, the American Egg exploded and burned while it was tied up for the night at the Orr's Island dock. The Harpswell line declared bankruptcy. Mass production was placing automobile ownership within reach of most Americans, and the era of the steamboat was over. The tourism industry began adapting to the here today and gone tomorrow needs of motorists. So Stowe's optimism, piety, and Victorian style were gravely wounded in the World War that left 8.5 million dead on the battle and 50 million dead in a global flu pandemic. The embittered young men and liberated young women of the lost generation had a darker vision with no room for the Pearl of Orr's Island. By 1925, with Prohibition and the Jazz Age in full swing, they were reading F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and Ernest Hemingway's In Our Time. More than 60 years after its publication, Stowe's novel was losing readership and Pearl tourism was declining. In 1925, Annie Thwing, now in her 70s, published a brief historical sketch, The Story of Orr's Island. There she offered her own opinions about Pearl sites and characters, but finally concluded, the story is purely fictitious and one of Stowe's own imagination. While Thwing believed that some of the characters might have been drawn from life, she warned that the subject was a matter of bitter controversy. We must treat it as ancient history, she wrote. The originals have long since passed into the great beyond, and their immediate descendants have also passed. Tradition now alone remains. In that watershed year of 1925, the Lee Bradford Corporation made one last effort to bring the Pearl of Oars Island into the modern era by transforming Stowe's novel into a silent movie, The Pearl of Love, starring Gladys Leslie as Mara and Burr McIntosh as Captain Kittridge. Of the 11,000 silent feature films released between 1912 and 1929, only 3,300 survive today, and sadly for us, The Pearl of Love is not one of them. All that remains of the film are 4 still photographs preserved in this 1925 photoplay edition of The Pearl of Oars Island. After publication of that 1925 movie tie-in, Stowe's novel sailed into oblivion. There would be no new edition of The Pearl of Oars Island until 1967, when a growing feminist movement demanded reprints of work by America's women writers. On Oars Island, surviving Pearl-themed businesses dropped away one by one. Only the Pearl House survived into the 1930s and 1940s. If you take a look at the 1936 message on this period linen postcard, you see the arrow and where it says she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. The author of the postcard assumes that home of the Pearl of Oars Island will be meaningless to the recipient, and that he or she might even need a little help remembering who Harriet Beecher Stowe was, that's sad. The final years of Pearl House as a tourist attraction were presided over by 2 charming hostesses from Richmond, New York, with family ties to the island. The widowed Lily Johnston Rydstrom and her sister Hazel, who owned a pair of Scotty dogs who apparently were equally memorable. The original kitchen and parlor were open to visitors as a museum, and there was a gift shop. But in 1952, after the sisters' passing, Pearl House became a private summer residence for a New Jersey family, and today it's been renovated pretty much beyond recognition. Some things, however, remained the same. A local reporter named Margaret Todd, writing in 1952 about this transition, interviewed a Captain William Sylvester, whom she called undisputed champion in the field of sea tales and island history. And Captain Sylvester apparently told her with a straight face that Harriet Beecher Stowe had written The Pearl of Oars Island in the grotto. I just love the idea of Stowe writing this book in the sea cave. Okay, having played a major role in the cultural transformation of Oars Island from fishing village to summer resort, the book quietly stole away. There are no pearl sites exhibited on the island today, no contemporary pearl-themed postcards or souvenirs. And yet I think there are still a few fools like me who want to hunt for the novel's traces on the island. And I think that the last word on this subject should belong to the old Oars Island captain that William Bishop met in 1880. You don't want to inquire too close into a good story. It's certain to spoil it. Thank you all.
Susan, thank you so much for that just simply delightful talk. It resonated for me on so many levels. One, as an islander myself, I grew up on Peaks Island, and just the idea of summer tourists and the tall tales that you tell. And then also, of course, you know, with the work that we do in special collections, that resonated so much in terms of thinking about the construction of history. And you've offered us just such a delightful view of that. So we have some questions that have come in through the Q&A forum, which you are welcome to add your own questions to in the audience. So let's take a few moments to explore those. You can also upvote by giving a little thumbs up in that forum. Okay, so the first question is coming from Lowell. Do you have any more record of how Prince's General Store was marketed to tourists? And this is coming from a Prince descendant writing now from Prince's Point.
Oh, wow, cool. There are other postcards of the store, and I was very interested by the information that the store was capitalized by the steamship lines. I don't have great information on this, but one favorite postcard that the store printed some of its own postcards that I was sorry not to include, was one of the dogs, the family dog.
Yeah.
Lovely, sheepdog looking dog. And the postcard is titled Prince of Orr's Island. So the Prince family once had this lovely dog named Prince, and he was being marketed to Pearl tourists as Prince of Orr's Island.
Oh, that's lovely.
I encourage you, if you are a Prince family descendant, to go on the Maine Memory Network. I know you might find some things there about the early days of the store, and also to hit eBay and just search for postcards, because there are bazillions of them. If 100,000 people or summer were showing up,
right,
they bought a lot of postcards, and eBay is definitely our communal attic.
Awesome. The next question is from Ronald. Down East Mountain Desert Island during the same time frame deliberately cultivated affluent visitors. Mansions rivaling Newport followed. Did those marketing Orr's Island focus their efforts and supportive hotel culture on any particular tourist group or point of tourist origin?
Well, okay, they focused heavily on Portland, people coming into Portland, and on the Casco Bay, that Casco Bay Circle route that we actually still have today for tourists. So they really focused more strongly on, a really middle-class audience. One relic of this that I didn't go into, the 1905 reporter notes that people are getting off the boat in Orr's Island, which is either the end of the line if you're coming to visit Orr's, or it's the middle of the line if you're taking a circle tour. And when they're getting off the boat, they are clamoring for lobster. That's the first thing they want to do, is eat lobster and then go visit the pearl sites, and then possibly get back on it and go to Portland. So it's really interesting to me that one of the cynics of Orr's Island is apparently the first lobsterman in Maine to invent and deploy a motorized haulback. So, and if you think about it today, Cook's Lobster House on Bailey's Island is still served by that steamboat. So it's a very middle-class route that they're working here. And you can see it actually in Brunhilde of Orr's Island, because the rich yachtsman is sailing from Newport to Bar Harbor when our heroine rows out to hitchhike on the yacht and to ensnare him with her charms. So
I'm so excited. I've added that to my reading list, so I'm really excited to check that out. The next question is from Hillary, who asks, what are your thoughts on this impulse of readers to travel to the places of fictional novels and writers? Thinking of walking tours of Dickens' London, Harry Potter train trips to Scotland, or using a movable feast as a guide to Hemingway's Paris. What's up with us humans wanting and loving to do this?
I think the impulse of tourism and the impulse to read are often very much the same. I mean, what are we looking for? We're looking for beautiful places, interesting experiences, neat characters, and that's what books are made of, and that's what tourism is made up out of, and it's huge. It's everywhere. I work on Hemingway. Is my main man, and there's a whole other story to be told about the for-profit Hemingway House Museum in Key West, where people are told that Hemingway wrote A Farewell to Arms there. He didn't. Where they're told that Hemingway kept six-toed cats there. He didn't, the cats are for sale. He got peacocks, but not cats. Or I used to live on Nantucket Island, which had an enormous trade in Moby Dick because it's like the whaling capital of the world, and Moby Dick is set on Nantucket, and the Pequod is a Nantucket ship. But Melville never visited the island until after Moby Dick was published. And, you know, you could walk up Main Street any day and hear a tourist telling somebody that this is the house where Melville wrote Moby Dick, even though he did that high and dry in the Berkshire Mountains. So I don't know, it's like a universal impulse, but I think it's because books are basically the same. We pick up books to go somewhere else. Right. And then if we really love the place that we went and the pages, then we want to do that, you know, for real. And Stowe, a little bit like Hemingway, was a real connoisseur of place. She was a regionalist. She picked up all these beautiful details, so that people wanted to be there.
I want to be conscious of the time, both of your time and of our viewers' time. We were just scheduled to go to 1:30, but I have one lovely question. There's so many great questions. My apologies to those who are asking them that we won't be able to get to them. But let's take this final question from Carl, who asks, would you recommend The Pearl to young readers today?
Absolutely. You know, I've taught it to college students, and I find that male readers maybe get a little impatient with it. Women readers are like, oh, this is like Little Women, or it's like Anne of Green Gables. So it is a more feminine book. The one thing you have to, you know, just adjust your sensibilities and be Victorian is that it is a religious book. You know, Harriet Beecher Stowe came from a huge family of preachers. She had 7 preacher brothers. Her father was directed a seminary. Her husband was a professor of religion. So there's a lot of religious reflection in it. But I would really hope that, you know, people could just adjust their sensibilities to another time and place and go and enjoy it. If you like Sarah Orne Jewett's Country of the Pointed Firs, you will probably like Pearl. I've also taught it in a Maine Women Writers course.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Susan, thank you again so much for your time, your enthusiasm, the cameo from the cat that you promised. No, but truly.
Very polite to wait till the end.
Truly, thank you so much for your time and your enthusiasm and your expertise. I am truly so inspired and have learned so much. So thank you. And a special thanks again to Tony Sprague for his technical assistance, and to the Bowdoin College Library for making this program possible. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. Be well and take good care, and we will see you all next time. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, everybody.